Hi, this is Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. Yes, I was right. Hank Paulson, we should have hung him when we had a chance. Stacy Herbert.
Yes, Max Keiser, Hank Paulson is in the news. I'll read the quick headline from Miss Shedlock here. Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson tipped off prominent hedge funds regarding Fannie Mae while telling the U.S. Senate and the general public a different story. Yes, he was aiding and abetting the financial terrorist at Goldman Sachs, but I want to roll back, Max, to November 16th, 2008, and this appearance by you on Al Jazeera. And, you know, the global financial system was collapsing. And they asked you what was going on. And you said it was Hank Paulson and Goldman Sachs, and they had issued fraudulent currencies and bonds around the world. Here's a little clip.
He's issuing counterfeit money, counterfeit bonds. That's why the global economy is in such a sad shape.
The solution is what?
You have to go into a court of law and take Hank Paulson and Goldman Sachs up for financial terrorism, put them in jail.
That may be one response to Hank Paulson, but as far as the international global economy is concerned...
Well, Max, okay, that's fine for Hank Paulson, but what about the global economy, as if it was different somehow from Hank Paulson's fraud?
Yeah, that's what people don't understand, is that when 30% of corporate profits, as the case of the U.S. or in Britain, 30% or higher, my calculation is closer to 60%, of the corporate profits come from a corrupt banking sector run by capo de capos like Hank Paulson, you're not going to get any progress in jump-starting your economy until, as I said in the video, Hank Paulson's head is bouncing down the Capitol stairs.
Well, actually, let's cut to that little clip here.
These guys are criminals. There should be a fatwa against these guys. He's an infidel. Hank Paulson, his head should be bouncing down the Capitol steps.
I mean, I'm sure it was metaphorical, Max.
Well, look, the global financial system, basically, you have to look at Dante's 7 circles of hell to really understand the magnitude and the intricacies of what we're talking about here. Within the deepest circle of hell is a guy like Hank Paulson. He's literally Satan's banker. And he has perpetrated this insider trading. He tipped people off on the inside weeks before it was made public by the government. So a couple of things become obvious. A, the government does the bidding of Goldman Sachs and Hank Paulson. B, the policies are meant to impoverish and disenfranchise the vast majority of the population to recreate feudalism in the global economy. And C, if the government isn't going to do anything to get rid of these financial terrorists, let's dispense with this idea of who is breaking the law, who is not breaking the law. There is no law except the law of street justice and vigilante law. That's the law. Now, I would have rather have seen Hank Paulson in the compromising position we saw Colonel Gaddafi at the end of his days than someone like Gaddafi, who's a victim of Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan. Let's put Hank Paulson through what they put Gaddafi through the last minutes of his life.
Okay, we're halfway through the show, the first half, and we have yet to tell people what he's been accused of at this point. So let's move on to what he's done. According to a whistleblower, Max, on July 13th, Hank Paulson was telling reporters who were going to then tell the American public, the voting population, that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac must remain shareholder-owned. He also had testified only 2 days earlier before the Senate that giving the government new power to intervene made actual intervention improbable. That was his famous bazooka sentence. He said, if you have a bazooka and people know you have it, you're not likely to take it out. This statement caused Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac shares to double in 4 days. Behind closed doors, at a meeting on July 21st, 2008, Hank Paulson was meeting with a dozen hedge fund managers, half of whom were ex-Goldman Sachs employees who worked with Hank Paulson when he was CEO of the company. So at this meeting, held at the offices of Eaton Park Capital Management in Manhattan, founded by Eric Mindich, formerly of Goldman Sachs, he was telling them that, in fact, the plan was to take Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac into government conservatorship. So at the time, shares for Fannie Mae were trading at $14.13, and shares of Freddie Mac were at $8.75. So this is a perfect opportunity. He gave them the information which will allow them to short the company and make huge profits.
That's right. They were gifted millions, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars as a gift. And that money, of course, came from the public trough, which we're now experiencing in the form of austerity measures. So the people who are suffering austerity measures around the world, because all these banks are connected, people in the UK, people in America, around the world, Greece, Ireland, they are doing so to pay for the gift that Paulson gave his cronies by violating the law, by manipulating markets, by threatening this bazooka analogy. And if Paulson, a private banker, gets to threaten the public with a bazooka, essentially he's got his own drones that he's operating, financial drones. That mere Gaddafi ending I suggested would be too good for Hank Paulson. Let's take the bazooka instead of the stick on Paulson.
Well, this whistleblowing fund manager who spoke to the press anonymously left after coffee with Hank Paulson and called his lawyer. The attorney's quick conclusion: Paulson's talk was material, non-public information, and his client should immediately stop trading the shares of Washington-based Fannie and McLean, Virginia-based Freddie. However, the other guys, we don't know whether or not they traded Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac shares. We'll never know because, of course, Obama and Eric Holder are always looking forward, not back.
Well, we do know all the trades that are recorded that go across the ticker tape, except, of course, trades that are conducted in these so-called dark pools, off-exchange trades, block trades that are done completely in the dark outside of any regulation. And that's why they exist, to conduct fraud on a massive scale. Paulson, of course, was one of the creators of the system where fraud can be conducted on these industrial levels. And again, I submit to you that in the pantheon of individuals, Pol Pot, Hitler, Stalin, Hank Paulson, who's committed more economic mayhem? Who's the biggest mass murderer? When this crisis is over in 5 years or 6 years, the number of the body count will exceed the worst tyrants in history, thanks to Hank Paulson.
Well, I think, in fact, you could compare them to the gangsters of the 20s and 30s. They brought terror to the communities. They got away with it. By the way, they had the support of the local communities. The likes of Al Capone and Lucky Luciano had the support of the communities because they used to bring turkeys around to the desperate populations who were unknowingly victims of these gangsters. They had fewer opportunities in life because of these gangsters, but because the gangsters gave them a free turkey and seemed to take care of the people when they needed it, they allowed these gangsters to get away with it. And now look how gangster Hank Paulson was, because the takeover of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac was effective September 6th, a Saturday. Normal people don't trade on Saturdays, do they? But these gangsters are allowed to trade on Saturdays, and the company's stock prices dropped immediately below $1 the following Monday.
Yeah, well, again, the markets are closed, but these off-exchange activities are happening, huge volume. The volume in the dark exchange, the off-market, is greater than the visible market. So it's like the galaxy and the cosmos itself. Some speculate that the dark matter and dark energy is greater than the visible world that we live in. This is true of the financial frauds on Wall Street. The amount of fraud's greater than what we see on a day-to-day basis. Hank Paulson is kind of like the Einstein of fraud. He's taken the entire concept of breaking the law and multiplied it times the coefficient of his own corrupt soul. He's Satan times Satan.
Well, I saw this word bazooka in the headlines again. And you know that Goldman Sachs bankers have been installed into governments as technocrats throughout Europe. Well, here's a headline also on Ms. Shedlock's Global Economic Analysis website. German finance minister says big bazooka not ready, would not stem crisis, even if it was, plans too intricate and complex for investors to understand. So according to Wolfgang Schäuble, Germany's finance minister, and remember Hank Paulson was finance minister when he used this phrase big bazooka, Europe's big bazooka bailout fund is not ready and won't stem the debt crisis that is pounding Italy and the rest of Europe. This suggests to me that, in fact, Wolfgang Schäuble is meeting in private with Goldman Sachs bankers and telling them to short the heck out of Europe right now because the plan is to pull the rug out from under them.
Well, we saw that in the Greece scenario. Remember, John Paulson, the hedge fund manager, was in Greece, in Athens, shortly before the crisis took hold there and was meeting with the government and instructing them on how he was going to rip that country down using massive short sales. So this financial terrorism, using weapons of mass financial destruction to destroy economies and impose austerity measures, is now taken to a much wider level. They want to take down the entire Eurozone. So this is why all these people who are suffering joblessness, who are starving to death, they can point to Hank Paulson as the originator of their duress.
Well, if past this prologue, look for the Eurozone to collapse on a Saturday. No banks will be open for a bank run, but all the big guys will have taken all their money out for sure. Now, a final headline here, Max, and this involves the heart of all the fraud, where it all was dumped was in the mortgage. It all happened in the mortgage crisis. And we've just been talking about a whistleblower who was attending this meeting with Hank Paulson. Foreclosure fraud whistleblower found dead. A notary public who signed tens of thousands of false documents in a massive foreclosure scam before blowing the whistle on the scandal has been found dead in her Las Vegas home. I want to say that the firm that she worked for was a Florida-based processing company used by most major banks to process repossessions. Police said at the time the alleged scam had thrown into question the legality of most Las Vegas home foreclosures of the past few years. So here you have whistleblowers who just end up dead. Anybody who could have exposed any of the information that is material and could be used against the likes of Hank Paulson.
Paulson whacked her. What's her name?
Tracy Lawrence.
Tracy Lawrence got whacked by Paulson's minions.
Well, like I said before, it reminds me of the 20s and the 30s. Any sort of witness who came forward, who whistle-blew on Al Capone or Lucky Luciano or Gambonis or any of these other mafia families in America, they ended up dead, always.
Exactly right. This is why we are saying this is a matter of life and death. The Hank Paulsons of the world, we need to do something about them. Thank you, Stacy, for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away. Much more coming your way, so stay right there. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to Iceland. Talk with Jan Thorsen of the Eva Jolie Institute. Jan Thorsen, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Hey, you're the Keiser.
Excellent. So, Jan, who is Eva Jolie and why is an institute named after her?
Eva Jolie is a former investigative judge from France, and she came to Iceland in 2009 to take part in the investigation into the fallen banks. I think she was a great inspiration for us here in Iceland. You know, she is somebody who stands up for democracy, freedom, and transparency, and has been fighting corruption for the last 30 years. Based on her example, we decided, because she has now left the investigation because of her obligations in France, and we decided that we wanted to keep her inspiration and build on it. And so we have set up this institute with the aim of fighting for these issues worldwide.
Let me ask you, some of the bankers responsible for the collapse of the Icelandic banking system have international warrants for their arrest. They live in Chelsea in London, and yet the UK has not executed those warrants. At the same time, of course, the UK was adamant about clawing back ill-gotten gains through the Icelandic iSave account. They seem to be duplicitous as the IMF in this regard. But here you have international warrants out for arrest for Icelandic bankers. They're living in Chelsea. These warrants have not been executed. What's going on, Jan?
London actually is, the most secretive of all financial capitals of the world. I mean, it's the biggest tax haven. I don't think it's in the interest of the financial sector to arrest any bankers or to get behind what actually has happened. And I mean, there is no difference between the banking system in the UK or in Iceland, except for the fact that the Icelandic bank system actually went bust because the Icelandic government didn't have the funds to prop it up.
Well, it's amazing because in the UK, a couple of months ago, they were hit with a wave of street riots from looters, as they were called by David Cameron, and yet he does nothing about looters that are looting billions of pounds, and he lets these financial terrorists, gives them safe harbor in the City of London, which has become kind of the one place where these banking charlatans can get protection from David Cameron. Now, in the United States, there have been no equivalent investigations into the banking sector, and so a majority of the population still views the criminal syndicate running the banking sector as, quote, wealth creators. Now, in your investigations into banking fraud, did you find any evidence that these bankers that are committing the fraud are creating wealth?
It's difficult for me to talk about specifics about the investigation, but I mean, I think it's apparent to everyone that the whole banking sector is, well, to quote William Black, he says that the banks are criminal organizations. We are in a situation where actually we're asking the patient to heal itself. I think it's apparent to everybody that the system has nowhere to go, and that we need to think new thoughts and do things in a different way. But everything that's being done so far is simply trying to revitalize an already corrupt and bankrupt system. And it goes for the banks, and it goes for so many other things in our society. There's no way we can continue on the route we are on.
All right, Jan, the IMF is claiming that Iceland is the poster child for their policies. That's clearly a lie, but we would expect that from the IMF. But other countries like Ireland and Greece are being subjected to banking terrorist acts. Has there been any communication between Iceland and Greece or in Ireland about sharing knowledge and experience about trying to protect yourself against the onslaught of these financial terrorists?
No, not that I know of, but I know that there are ideas around here in Iceland that it would be a good idea to share experiences with both Ireland and Greece, and with some of the older clients of the IMF, for instance, in South America, like Argentina and Ecuador, who have gone down another route and actually decided not to pay off their debts and have thrown the IMF out.
Why is there no communication? Because you have a global movement, this Occupy movement, which is at one point had 1,000 cities around the world. They're all basically fighting the exact same fight that Iceland has been fighting, that Greece is fighting, that Ireland is fighting. You have articulate mouthpieces like Naomi Klein, who's on television a lot. She clearly knows what's going on, and yet there's no global effort or a central place in which to create an onslaught back, to push back in any economically reasonable, forthright manner. It seems completely jumbled. Why isn't it? Why? I mean, Iceland has got hammered by banking terrorists. Why can't they? Why is that message not getting out to these other countries as to how they can protect themselves? What's the problem there?
I think people are, waking up to the reality of the situation, and I think the Occupy movement shows that. But it's all relatively new. This mobilization is just a few months old. It took 30 years to get us into the position we're in now, and it's going to be a slow process going back. But I think it's a very, very good idea to make a global movement where there is actually contact between people from different countries so that they can share experiences.
Well, I hear you that there's a process that needs to take place in terms of people waking up. But if people get raped, financially speaking, I would think they would be pretty awake about the crime that was just committed. I know that in Ireland, for example, they threw out the embassy, the Irish embassy was removed from the Vatican because of the Catholic priest pedophile scandal. It finally went too far, and the Irish people said, we can't support this any longer, and they pulled their embassy out of the Vatican. They were quite ashamed by that. Now we have the IMF is doing the same thing to the financial system as these pedophile priests were doing to the religious system. So, there's got to be an outrage. I don't understand it. Is it my own thought is that underneath as working as a stockbroker myself for many years, I know that one of the keys in understanding these crimes is that the victims of financial fraud, like in Iceland or Ireland or Greece, they tend to blame themselves. Is this the case? Do the Icelandic people blame themselves for having been financially raped by the IMF and others?
You know, one of the problems we have in Iceland, and I think this goes for many other countries as well, is that the press is not free. You know, the reporting on what's actually going on, what the reasons are, what actually has been going on in the banks is not as good as one could wish. And I mean, I think in Iceland, as in many other places, there is this theory, we call it here the plasma screen theory. And this was launched by one of the bankers, that one of the reasons why the economy was in this situation was because people had spent too much. But, you know, public debt in Iceland was, or the debt that the banks held when they went down was something like 10 times Icelandic GDP. And private debt was only a tiny fraction of that. But this is a story that we're being, you know, fed with, that, you know, it's the general public that's to blame rather than the banks themselves and the financial sector.
Well, I think that's a good point, because just in the past week in the United States, for example, we saw during the so-called Black Friday, day after Thanksgiving, there was a surge of shopping where some people died. There was mass rioting because the government loves that. The U.S. government is out there supporting this unruly, rioting, homicidal behavior to get that latest gadget at the Walmart. But at the same, so they support consumerism. But at the same time, the banks are creating these 10 to 20 times GDP in off-balance sheet debts that can't ever possibly be repaid. So the same mixed message in Iceland is what you're telling me. They're saying that the consumers caused the crisis in one breath, even though the solution from the IMF is to get consumers consuming again without ever paying any attention to the real problem, which is that the banks are fraudulent, nightmarish psychopaths.
Change doesn't come from above. Change comes from below. It's the grassroots, and it's the ordinary people of any society that make the changes. But I mean, I think we have to be patient. I mean, I think there are a lot of positive things that have been going on. I mean, the Occupy movement is one. People are waking up to this new reality that we are actually living in. But I think it's going to take a while for people to, you know, gather the thoughts and come up with new ways and new ideas on how to organize. I think one of the key issues is democracy. It's the only way we can, you know, take the power away from the politicians, is give it back to the people.
Let me ask you, the Icelandic krona and the economy collapsed, and now Icelandic economy is coming back. And the rating agencies are upgrading Icelandic debt. So for those in Greece and Ireland who say that if they were to pull out of the euro and their bonds would collapse, nobody would ever buy their bonds again. That's not true, is it?
The Icelandic government has issued bonds recently, and it went rather well. But I think perhaps, you know, you have to rethink this whole thing. I mean, why shouldn't the state itself create its own money? Why should it have to go onto the international market and pay interest on money that's created out of thin air by the banks that are lending the money? You know, the state can issue its own currency.
Well, Iceland nationalized the three biggest banks. Is that still the case?
Well, no, they were not nationalized. One of the banks is, majority of the shares is owned by the Icelandic state, but the other two banks are now in the hands of foreign vulture funds. I mean, they bought the claims on the banks for, you know, cents on the dollar right after the crash. And they are now these two banks are now being controlled by these foreign hedge funds.
Okay, so you have a foreign entity, hedge funds from abroad, controlling two of your banks.
Yeah.
Is there any initiative within the government or any policies to try to rid yourself of these vultures?
No. I mean, you know, this is the market solution. And I mean, obviously these people aren't in the business for the long run. I mean, their aim is just to maximize the return on their claims, and it's going rather well. They have increased in value by some between 30 and 40%, I believe.
Right, but presumably within that is the seed for yet another cycle of over-indebtedness and financial crimes being committed again. So you haven't rooted out the cancer, in other words.
No, I mean, what happened was that the new banks, they took over claims on Icelandic house owners at a discount. They are being claimed at the full price. So there's a lot of money to be earned here, and there is no. I mean, the government has said there is no way there will be any sort of debt relief for homeowners.
All right, Jan Thorsen, that's all the time we have. Thanks again for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you.
That's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Jan Thorsen of the Eva Joly Institute. You can follow us on Twitter or on Facebook. Just look for Keiser Report. You can send me an email at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, Max Keiser saying, bye, y'all.